Welcome to the 21st Annual SELC Conference. In this panel, we will be discussing housing, gentrification, and inequity and policy implications. My name is Melissa Rosenfelt. I am an MPA student and teacher's assistant and research assistant at the University of Central Oklahoma. I'm a member of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, member of the Ocheesee Band and Deer Clan. It is my pleasure to be your moderator for this session. It's an honor to introduce our esteemed panelists for this critical discussion on housing, gentrification, and inequities. Our panelists today are Gabriel Bassey, Bharath, Keandra Davis, Menka, Sethi, and now I would like to turn the floor over to our esteemed presenters. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. My name is Gabriel Bassey, and today I'll be presenting the paper myself and Dr. Kiowa are currently working on, and I would like to share the slides in order to proceed with the presentations. Can everyone see the slide? Okay. So the topic for today is titled Environmental Justice and Gentrification, a case study of 4 of Houston's historic African-American neighborhoods. Sorry for the fact that I arrived late. I had some technical difficulties and it took me a while to connect into the session. So I'd like to apologize for that first. So first and foremost, we'll look at some brief definitions of environmental justice and gentrification, but we can see environmental justice as this idea that all people and communities have the right to equal environmental protection under the law and the right to live, work, and play in communities that are safe, healthy, and free of life-threatening conditions. And gentrification, we can also see it as the transformation of neighborhoods from low value to high value. But that term was coined by an author called Ruth Glass in 1964 in her famous book titled London Aspects of Change. And in her book, she identified key characteristics of the term, and it involved the influx of a more educated and wealthier group, major improvements in properties, and the displacement of original, less educated, poor residents. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of what environmental justice and gentrification in certain predominantly Black and Brown communities entails. And just looking at the subtle and covert forms of environmental degradation resulting from the dumping of hazardous waste pollutants in predominantly Black and Brown communities, this has always been a major concern that has plagued people who live of close proximity to these neighborhoods for decades. And this, according to certain urban planners and environmental development scholars, it has caused increased concerns. And also, this has led to different people from different walks of life to think of plausible solutions to this issue. And certain neighborhoods are underdeveloped and lack open green space, clean and affordable housing resources, as well as resilience against natural disasters. And at the end of the day, they are susceptible to undergo gentrification. And this concept of gentrification actually became very prominent in the 1970s as a result of certain residents, especially the low-income residents in these gentrifying neighborhoods, being displaced due to the increase in rental costs and other standards of living in the various neighborhoods. So certain research goals we hope to accomplish in this research endeavor is the examining of the impact of gentrification in these predominantly African-American communities in the city of Houston that have experienced gentrification, since the 20th century due to implementation of certain municipal environmental improvement plans. And the neighborhoods in question are 3rd Ward, 5th Ward, Independence Heights, and Sunnyside. All are historically Black neighborhoods in the city of Houston, Texas, in Harris County. And some research questions being asked in this project are, how do environmentally distressed neighborhoods change once they are remediated? What impact does environmental remediation have on housing costs? And what are the sustainable remedies that are available to both the city of Houston and local private developers in preventing the displacement of residents in affected communities? And I'm going to show some demographic shifts in 4 historically Black neighborhoods in Houston, Texas, as a result of the gentrification process. Now, there are other factors or indicators of the gentrification process, and there are other factors that has led to these figures we're about to see. But we chose these 2 indicators because it applies to housing, and that really affects the living conditions of the residents. So the 2 gentrification indicators here would be renter versus the homeowner occupancy and the median home sale price for these 4 neighborhoods. The first neighborhood we'll be looking at is 5th Ward. We can see that from year 2000 to 2018, there has been a minuscule increase in the amount of owner-occupied units in that neighborhood. And we can see that for the most part, the majority of the residents in that neighborhood have been renter-occupied in terms of their units. Then we look at 5th Ward, the same 5th Ward in terms of the median home sale prices. We can see that in 2011, it was at $143,000 roughly, and as at 2018, it rose close to $280,000, even way higher than the median home sale price of Harris County, meaning something definitely took place that led to these disparities in under a 7-year span. It's even higher now. And we're looking at Independence Heights as the second neighborhood. As you can see, there has even been a gradual decline in owner-occupied units and a constant increase in renter-occupied units. And the renter-occupied units also are the majority in terms of the percentages of the residents. And the median home sale prices, also there's a huge gap from 2011 at $52,000 to almost $270,000 in 2018, still higher than that of Harris County. So several factors have led to that increase, not just gentrification only, but gentrification from research has played a major role in that price gap. Then we look at 3rd Ward, which is somewhat different from others, but the same trend still continues. You can see in year 2000, the owner-occupied units was at 23%, 2010, 21, 2% decrease, and 2018, 25, 4% increase. But overall, the renter-occupied units are still the majority of residents in the 3rd Ward neighborhood. And we can see same thing with median home sale prices. Now, it wasn't as high as the previous neighborhoods we've just seen, but there's still a clear-cut gap, meaning that increase from 2013 to 2018. And then it was lower than the median home sale price in Harris County, but now it's a lot higher based on certain estimates by realtors in Houston. Then Sunnyside is the final neighborhood we'll be looking at in terms of these demographic shifts. And you can see it's similar to the previous neighborhoods we've just seen. From year 2000, there has been a sharp decline in terms of owner-occupied units and a steady increase of renter-occupied units from year 2000 to 2018. Same thing with the median home sale prices. It was $38,611 as at 2012, and now in 2018 is $148,950. So there is that huge increase in terms of the price of median home sales in the Sunnyside neighborhood. So at the end of the day, just for the sake of comparison, we look at the renter versus homeowner occupancy in Harris County, and we can see that in Harris County, there are more residents that fall under the owner-occupied units compared to the renter-occupied units. So that already negates the trend that we've just seen in those neighborhoods. So something is definitely happening that is causing that trend in those 4 neighborhoods, even though it's almost impossible to absolutely pinpoint it to what we just saw. But we know that there are several factors that have led to that increase in the differences. So some of the policy implications and recommendations that really needs to be looked onto would involve that gentrification patterns across Houston, Texas saw their most significant change during the period between 2000 and 2010 when compared to the very little change that occurred between 1990 and 2000. And the pattern has been on a rise since 2010 until, and will continue to spread in vulnerable and susceptible neighborhoods in Harris County. So 2010 was when gentrification was, in terms of the impact of gentrification in certain neighborhoods, it was very visible between 2008 and 2010. Now, there might have been other factors that would have led to that being the case, but just looking at the numbers, we can clearly see that that major leap in terms of those changes occupied sometime between 2008 and 2010. But ever since then, it's constantly been in an increase. It's not really gone down ever since 2010. And another thing people don't really pay much attention to is gentrification in terms of the neighborhoods being gentrified. For the most part, the impact doesn't just affect the neighborhoods that are being gentrified, it also affects neighborhoods that are surrounding the neighborhoods that are being gentrified. Because if you think of it, gentrification for the most part involves influx of people into a neighborhood. So definitely they are leaving other neighborhoods into a specific neighborhood. And just that process alone, you can tell that certain neighborhoods are definitely affected in terms of like the population of people there, the businesses, the racial demographics, even displacement patterns. There are several changes that are taking place in other surrounding neighborhoods, not just the neighborhoods being gentrified. So people sometimes forget that this phenomenon is not only affecting the neighborhoods in question that are being gentrified. So at the end of the day, gentrification can have multiple effects on population growth, local businesses, racial demographics, displacement patterns, educational attainment levels, and all around, those gentrifying neighborhoods and the surrounding neighborhoods as well. And of recent, there has been this renewed sense of urgency to push for equity in the United States, especially during events such as the COVID-19 pandemic, social justice protests that has led to killings and increase in severe climate change impacts in an already divided society. And this displacement cycle and revitalization have been significantly impacted by these issues. So it is very crucial to note here that revitalization can actually happen without displacements. And planners are very capable of sparking neighborhood growth without fundamentally altering the character if certain equitable strategies and policies are in place. And the attainment of an equitably revitalized neighborhood can be done through the provision of certain strategies or suggestions such as new mixed income housing, housing preservation, and even employment opportunities that benefit existing low-income residents. And another way to also mitigate gentrification is by improving educational attainment and building up entrepreneurial businesses, which should increase residents' earning potential as part of the housing affordability-related strategies that invest in places and people. Final thoughts. it makes sense that a collaborative effort from public officials, private agencies, nonprofit organizations, scholars, and other interested groups to draft and implement equity-centered policies that target environmental degradation due to race and displacement issues can help to finally put an end to environmental racism, injustices, and displacement for good. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, we encourage you to use the chat Q&A, or you're welcome to raise your hand and we'll recognize you. Looks like Karen has a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Karen, did you have your hand up? Okay, that's fine. Karen, if you, oh, she's applauding. Thank you, Karen.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
So yeah, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. If not, we'll go ahead and move on with Dell's presentation.
I had a quick go ahead. Emma, there's 3 questions or 3 hands up.
Hi, quick question for the speaker. Is there an equity-centered policy in this area that you're currently impressed with? You know, we always ask for policies, but sometimes there's already policies that maybe you might want to highlight.
So far, I haven't really seen any policy that has led to the impact that the policy suggests. So there are definitely different, equity-centered policies. But for the most part, those policies exist, but are not really implemented the way they should to lead to the impact that is expected. So I haven't really seen a policy that exists that has led to the outcome that was intended so far, especially as it pertains to those neighborhoods in Houston. But things gradually change daily, and I can't say that it would continue this way, but definitely more needs to be done.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Edward, you have your hand up?
Thank you very much. How you doing? I have a few questions. I lived in Houston, Texas for 14 years before I moved up to the Dallas area. I did a research back in 1985 and published at Texas Southern University on urban housing policies. Gentrification was an issue of mine. One of my questions is, how far back did your research go in terms of gentrification? Because in that area, gentrification has been going on for a long time, and which it did the 4th Ward. Yes. That's been totally gentrified. Another thing is that, did you take a look into the building codes ordinance for Houston? Because you can build a commercial building next to any house, yes, any residential house in yes, Houston, Texas, yes, and it doesn't need your permission because there is no building code, which I think is crazy. It's a farce, and that's and another thing. After the 1985 and after 1987 Wilson's theory on spatial mismatch, the federal government, in terms of Congress implementing the Moving to Opportunity intervention demonstration program, that it kind of assisted gentrification in the moving of Black African Americans and minorities out of the inner city to the outskirts, to gated community apartments, hoping that they'll get a better education and better jobs, but the loss of transportation. I was just curious how far back, and did you get a chance to look at that? Because I spoke in that time, 1980 and 81 and 82, I spoke to the community development director of Houston, and I got a lot of information on there, and I got charts and everything. And I just was curious how far you went back on that. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I started off from the 90s up till now because I wanted to look at like the 30 years span to see what has really changed. And from what I observed, it's always been a constant work in progress. It's still not gotten to exactly where it needs to be at. And in the same Houston, like you said, there's no zoning over here. Like there are no measures that should restrict how and where you should locate certain properties. And like you said, you know, it almost feels like developers over here have a lot of leverage towards how things are being done. So like I said, we just still, Houston really needs, you know, practicable equity-based policies that would address a lot of these inequities, because at the end of the day, when the leverage keeps being tilted to developers and the people that have the most influence over the structure of the city, the trend will likely continue in this space. So I've actually looked at those codes, and nothing significant has changed, even though there are constant discussions on potential policies that will be implemented. But so far, there has not been that, you know, policy that has caused that drastic change, at least for the past 30 years, based on my research so far.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All righty, we'll go on to our next presentation from Assistant Professor Del Bharath. We'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. And if y'all have any questions as I go, just put it in the chat or we'll take them after. I want to make sure everybody has time. And I'm going to try to be really short because this is my dissertation that I took way too long to write. Do not get an academic job until you finish your dissertation. Finish that. So for everybody writing dissertations. But I wanted to talk about gentrification. So I'm very glad I'm going after Gabriel because he did all the definitions and he explained everything. So I get to really cut things out. And this is going off of my dissertation where I looked at what policies cities were using. And I tried to create a typology of cities, whether they were more pro-social and they had those equity policies, or whether they were more pro-growth and they had more economic measures of redevelopment. And then using that, I tried to see what the gentrification index was and whether policy made an impact. And really quick, what I found was that there were not a lot of pro-social policies being used. And I looked at 103 mid-sized cities, and there was very low gentrification happening in these cities. So I thought that that was really interesting. And that's kind of what I want to discuss in this presentation. So I'm at Savannah State University, but you know, going into this research. And I'm just going to tell you all a story about gentrification. So if you watched the Super Bowl last year, you know, for the commercials, but for hopefully the halftime show, it was a show, right? They were in the SoFi Stadium. It was the first Super Bowl in that stadium. It's a new stadium in Inglewood. They brought, you know, South Central, Compton, Inglewood, all these areas to the stadium, and we had a wonderful show. And, you know, Dr. Dre was there singing California Love, talking about Inglewood, always up to no good. So in the 90s, Inglewood had this, you know, reputation of not being up to any good, but you know, it was still very much a culture of California, right? And now they've built the SoFi Stadium. So we're looking at our own positions as public administrators or planners and seeing this change, and now we're putting in this, you know, huge stadium into this city that has been traditionally Black and has had this long history. You know, what are some of the implications that we can think about? So if you know Inglewood, if you haven't, whenever you go, please try Randy's Donuts. It's wonderful. Actually, in LA, any donut shop like Dunkin' Donuts, they're all just really great. But you know, when you look at Inglewood, it has this very long history of the Black population, and now with the Hispanic population moving in, and we have the SoFi Stadium. So rich tradition that you can go into, but predominantly working class. Oops, sorry, wrong way. And with the SoFi coming in, we hear different stories, right? We hear about the housing prices going up, which is great if incomes are rising at the same time, right? So if you have a family that's working class living in this neighborhood and taxes are going up, rents are going up, but their salaries aren't going to go up, they're not going to be able to live in that neighborhood, right? So it's great that this development is there and it's raising prices, it's increasing the equity of the area, but those benefits are not felt by all. So there could be the potential of gentrification unless we have the policies in place to make sure that we're protecting our citizens. So again, from this idea of we know this is happening, what can we do? If we look at the demographics over the last 40 years, we can see that the white population has increased from 1980 from 20% all the way down to, it went to 2.9 in 2010, and now it's up a little bit to 4.1. Our Black population went from 56% all the way down to right now it's at 38%. And our Hispanic population has gone from 19% to 51%. So we were seeing, that change from Black community to Hispanic, but we're still looking at BIPOC populations, while white populations and other non-Hispanic populations are still relatively low. And then if we actually look at it and take the factors that are involved with gentrification and neighborhood change, so this was part of the dissertation and the methodology, was looking at the factors that, can show gentrification is occurring or not, or like show how neighborhoods are changing by zip code. We can see that, in 1990, where there's the areas of red, those are the very low income, and then the orange is low, green is middle, and the dark green is high. And in Inglewood, we saw that, there's some areas of concern that's very poor, some poor, poor neighborhoods, poor, and then some middle class. And then in 2020, we're seeing, there's a little bit more green happening. By 2010, it's a lot more of the green, some of the oranges, the red is almost gone. And then by the time 2019, we're seeing a lot less. So if we're looking at these images and just looking at the values, Inglewood looks like it's doing great, right? It's just positive growth. We're not seeing any challenges. This is great. We want a community that there's going to be social upward mobility for all. So if we're looking at a picture in 1,000 words, this is going to be great for our community that it's all doing great. And then using this methodology again, you can measure for gentrification and see if there's gentrification occurring. In Inglewood, California, using one of the methodologies that I found online, and this was developed in Chicago, it actually shows that there's no gentrification occurring. So again, as a city planner, if I'm looking at this, I'm saying this development is great. I want like SoFi, I want all these multi-million-dollar condos, I want all the rates to improve. I'm not going to do anything because this is looking wonderful, right? So just looking at the data that's presented to us and the story that it tells, I'm not worried. This is what I want. And it's so different if you take a qualitative look at this, and you actually go into Inglewood and you talk to the residents, because they will tell you that they can no longer afford to live there. They will talk about they will discuss, who is moving into the neighborhood. And when we have different groups mixing, we would love the idea that there's that social mix and everybody gets along. And, the idea of like deconcentrating poverty actually works and people accept each other, but that's not the case. Usually the in-movers are trying to oust the people that are there. They expect their culture. It's written about like different cultures. So like Black culture, and especially like in Inglewood, people are outdoors. They're hanging out in the corner. They're fixing their car in front of the house. They're hanging out. But white culture, it's usually inside, and you're going into your backyard, into your patio, and you invite people in instead of meeting them outside. And when you see like somebody fixing the car, you're like, that's going to be my property value going down. Or if you're seeing people congregating in the streets, you're like, that's dangerous. And, so there's this entire different shift in culture that doesn't allow for cultures to mix, right? So you'll have a neighbor calling the police on somebody, who's walking their dog, or being Black or whatever it is, all the carrots. But anyway, so we see that happening. But you have to get that qualitative side. So quantitatively, when we're looking at things, it might look positive, but qualitatively, we might get a different story. And a lot of times when we're looking at this from the administration and planning point of view, we have to think about our budgets and what it is that we can do in the time. And that's usually quantitative, because qualitative does take a little bit more time to do. So if, we're only presenting a certain side of the story. And when I was doing my dissertation, I was living near Inglewood. I was teaching at Dominguez Hills. And so I was like astounded that I was seeing that there was no gentrification happening, when I'm like, no, I can see it. And then I moved to Savannah, Georgia. And again, it's like, oh, no, gentrification is happening on paper. And I'm like, my students, I'm at HBCU, my students are like, we can see the gentrification happening block by block. So very different stories. So just to rewind, I wanted to make sure and get the story out. But getting into the methods, I did look and see what type of measurements people were doing to measure gentrification. Because it's one of those things that's such a complex term that, we know that it's the changes in value, in housing values, and rents, in education. There's these different variables, but what actually goes into it? So one of them that I found that I had really thought was interesting was the Voorhees, and they actually used 13 variables because they were very specific to Chicago. And because I was looking at cities, I only used 9 variables to see. And I used that to track from 1990 to now and see what the gentrification index of cities were. And then I also used, if you ever go to governing.com, they did a study on gentrification, and they developed a methodology based off of Freeman, who in 2005 did this, tried to see if there was displacement, and he said it didn't happen. And then everybody kind of adopted his methodology. And I was like, why are we using a methodology that's saying it doesn't even happen? But, so are we setting ourselves up to fail? But anyway, so I used him because it's a traditional one that people use. But I did adjust it because I looked at smaller cities. So some of the variables adapted. But I just wanted to see what happened. And and the other thing I did was, some literature said that you should look at it before 1990 because there was this little housing bubble, and some articles said after 2000. So I did vote for the governing one, and then for the Voorhees, I did it from 1990. And oops, sorry, I think I would be better at PowerPoint. Anyway, what I found was that there's different rates, right? So if you looked at the Voorhees, and if that was the methodology you used, 59 cities out of the 103, so 57% gentrified. There was some level of gentrification occurring. Whereas if you use the governing and you use the information from 2000, it had the least amount, right? 39% of cities gentrified. And the levels of gentrification, varied. So like in one city, if I use governing in 1990, it showed 83% of tracts gentrified. While if I use the 2000, it was only 63%, right? And just to give you an example of, again, what that would look like, if I can't remember what city 34 is, but if I use Voorhees, no gentrification is occurring. If I use this one, it would be 83, this one would be 63. And there was no consistency to say, like, if I use Voorhees, I'd get a lower rate, because here it was higher with 29%, whereas it's 5%, with governing. So there were just variables all across the table, and values and everything, which again is very interesting. So again, thinking about telling a story and, the role of public administration, we can tell whatever story we want, because the idea is, we have different ways of measuring. So if I wanted to say a story of all the redevelopment that I'm doing is great, I can use a different methodology and show that there's no gentrification occurring, that it's all wonderful. It could be like Inglewood. We don't have to do anything. We just continue to let it go as is, right? Or if I was a community organizer, I could use a value that says, this is really horrible, we need to fix it now, and make a call for action. But there's inconsistency, right? And gentrification is such a horrible thing, really, when we think about equity and social equity. And, it is, when we think about these changes that are happening, they are government sponsored, right? Like having the stadium be put into Inglewood, which, has been a disinvested area. And that is a government decision. So government is allowing it, but are they putting in the protections for the residents? Because their incomes aren't going up. If your property taxes rises and your income doesn't go up, it's no fault of yours that you cannot live there anymore. So, you know, when you're getting displaced, it's through no fault of your own. So real quick, and this was just really to think about what are the implications. And I'm so glad y'all talked about policy, because we know in policy, like the two, like for me, the 2 points for gentrification is one, that identification. We have to say that it's occurring, that there, you know, we can measure it, we can show it, because if we can't identify a problem, then it doesn't enter the policy cycle, right? When we think about agenda setting, trying to get, you know, advocates and everything, it doesn't exist. Why do we even have to bother? And then on the other end, if we're thinking about the policies that we have, and if we're trying to evaluate it, so we're using these more growth policies and not social policies, but our growth policies, when we evaluate them, they're saying that we're not doing anything wrong, this is good, then, you know, we're not going to make any changes, and we're gonna adjust it. So this was really a long way of saying is that, you know, when we come into gentrification research, there are challenges in how we measure it. And if we can't measure it, then, you know, we can't tell that story to be able to even get policy or to, you know, adapt policy to address the issue. So that is me. And if y'all have any questions, I'm happy to answer after, but I want to make sure the other ladies get a chance to go.
Thank you. All right, Keandra or Menka, who would like to go next? All right, Keandra, you're up.
I'll need the screen share. Okay, there it goes. Can you guys see my screen? Okay. All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keandra Davis. I'm a doctoral student, actually just finished my first year at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm a GRA with RISE. My research interests are housing policy, economic opportunity, and social equity. Sorry. Okay. So my research question is reparations, wealth inequality and home ownership, evaluating the impacts of redline neighborhoods on social mobility for Black Americans. And so this is actually a working paper that I started this past spring semester. So it's, you know, still in the preliminary, especially my analysis section. But I thought this was just such an important conversation. Like the more that I was like diving into like the literature on redlining, and just looking at just some of the impacts that federal policy has had, you know, with various minority communities. You know, with redlining, we know about the disenfranchisement that it's caused in various minority communities. So we know that, you know, with banks, we know that loan corporations rejected home loans, you know, especially for Black communities in these redline neighborhoods. We know that they were categorized as being the most hazardous, and they actually had different scales depending on that minority population group. Red was the most hazardous. There was yellow that was, you know, still risky, but, you know, they're may not be too terrible, you know, and then I believe it's green was, you know, your most affluent, you know, non-risky, and it was predominantly white population. And so we also saw the push to suburbanization, where single parent families were pushed, you know, to live in the suburbs, where we saw a lot of minority communities were left behind in disenfranchised urban areas. And so the area that I wanted to focus on was specifically mobility. I think back to just how much federal policy has created just, you know, really terrible outcomes for a lot of minority populations. And I don't see too much of that in the literature, looking at mobility and just what that looks like today and how it's continually impacting these groups. And so that's what kind of led me to, you know, just kind of further investigating this. And some of the disadvantages that I brought up that we see today were, you know, poor maintenance with inherited homes. You know, a lot of those are, you know, a negative result of, again, not having that income, not having that wealth, and all being a result of mobility. I looked at business sustainability, especially when we look at economic crisis years, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. And I also put out delayed debt repayment, so that being credit card debt, as well as, you know, just like credit card debt, and most importantly, student loan debt. That's, you know, a trending conversation now. And also put educational disparities. So some of the literature that I wanted to make sure I highlighted, working on my paper, were Black families earned $57.30 for every $100 in income compared to white households. We also found that the top 1% accounted for 43.5% of wealth distribution, compared to the lower 50%, they only accounted for negative 0.36 in wealth distribution, and that included both assets and debt. We also saw that Black people with at least one child, 18 years of age, they were at a further disproportionate rate in that Black wealth accumulation. So again, we, kind of thinking about children, born into families that, low income to moderate families, but again, like that wealth levels are just not, they're just not there. And so looking in the long term, what is the impact that that's having on the generations to come? And what are things that we could be, like measures we could be putting in place to, improve the generations? The next thing I kind of found in the literature was in 2019, we find that the home ownership rate for Black households was 42%, and there was no change into this present day. So 1970, it was a 42% home ownership rate, and it's at the exact same rate today. Whereas for Hispanic households in 1970, it's even lower. So today it's lower by 80% reported in the census from 1970. And then we go into the COVID-19 impact. So we saw a lot of wage losses from, people losing their jobs. And again, looking at the long term, so not having assets, not having savings, what are the long-term impacts of these things, and having to sell your homes because you couldn't afford it. So I really want to focus on those economic crisis years, and I get more into that a little bit later. So here's just a diagram that I want to show. This was taken from Forbes, and they sourced this from Prosperity Now and the Institute for Policy Studies. And I just want to give a graphic to kind of show this difference in wealth levels. We're kind of talking about the racial wealth gap now a lot more, but I want to get that visual as we can see starting in 1983. So this graph was taken in 2017. And so we can see for Black and Hispanic households, we can see the rates between 4 to a little bit under 7,000. Whereas in white households, we're already starting at 102, the median household wealth. And so we see over the years, just the largest changes that we see. And again, this was done in 2017, this chart here, and already they projected in 2020 and then 2024, the significant disproportions and decreases in wealth. And so being that we're already in 2022 and, unforeseen things have happened, the pandemic, inflation, these rates are probably going to get even lower. So the variables that I, plan to use for my research, my IV, I look at the top 10 red line cities, and these were categorized as being the most segregated and economically disadvantaged. And so these were cities, taken from 1933s during when redlining occurred up until now. So basically we saw a large population share. So still a lot of Black households and population groups remain in these cities. And so those were kind of measured or considered as the top 10 redline cities. I also look at income levels, and I look at levels of wealth, specifically measuring that by using the debt to income ratio. For my control variables, I want to look at home ownership rates, the percent of population, so the percent Black, as well as percent white. And then for my DV, I want to, run regressions and look at the impacts of these on the mobility. And so I measure mobility. That was kind of tricky, but I measure mobility, or anticipate to measure mobility by using income and wealth levels. So my hypothesis is that social mobility outcomes will continue to decrease across the top redline cities and during economic crisis years for Black households. For my methodology that I want to use, so again, looking at those redline cities, I thought it was so interesting. Most of them actually came from the Northeast Mid-Atlantic areas, and that was taken from HOLC maps. For my homeownership rates, I will take that from the census tract, as well as my social mobility variable, census tract, and my wealth. My wealth variable will come from the Federal Reserve, and all of this data will be collected for both Black and white households for each economic year. And the years that I want to focus on are the recession, so 2008, and then as well as the pandemic, so more recent, and just kind of see, what are some of those impacts, what are those changes, what are we seeing in terms of wealth. So for my analysis, I would run a quasi-experimental pre-post test, again, looking at those years. So I would look at it from 2006 to 2008. And then with COVID-19, look at it from 2019 to 2021 and see what were those changes throughout, specifically in those cities that have those large populations of both Black and Hispanic households. And I would run 3 multiple linear regression models, both changing my variables based on homeownership rates, running that on mobility, same thing with my top red line cities, but separating them based on income and my wealth level variable. And so lastly, wrapping up this presentation, some of my conclusions and policy recommendations. This is another one that's trending right now, and that's reparations. It's just such a controversial topic right now, but I think it's so important, especially when we talk about redlining. Exploring more, and we're all learning, and it's just the federal government, federal policies, especially housing policies, have just played such a large role in disenfranchising so many minority communities. And so I think it's only right that we're pouring back into these communities from federal policy, from a policy perspective. And so I thought about, forms of reparation as possible policy outcomes. And so expanding baby bonds, already starting out with 1,000 and just seeing the changes, for every dollar that it equals over time to 100. And just looking at some of the literature, a child by the age of 18 already has about 18,000 saved for low-income families. So, just expanding on that across states, finding better measures to really just improve generations. And something else that I thought was really important was redistributive efforts to invest back in Black communities. So when I think back to a lot of those federal policies, they use housing amortization for mortgage homeowners. And so people that were denied in 1930s, I think they should be, paid back for just a lot of those issues. Or same thing with inherited homes that have been in existence for over 50 years. We see the impacts that has had over the years, not having enough income to repair your homes, and just all the impacts, health. There's so many intersections with that. And so, yeah, I think it's really important that we're having this conversation more. I love that people are talking a lot more about the racial wealth gap, because it is so important. It impacts all of us. All of these issues do. And yeah, I'm really hopeful, for what the future holds, and want to leave you guys all with this quote. And it is, "Great is wealth when there's no guilt attached to it." So I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Keandra. Very compelling information. Thank you for your work. All right, Menka, you're up next. And Dr. Edward, I believe they were wanting your contact information in the chat so the panelists can get in touch with you.
Thank you.
Great.
Yes.
All righty, Menka. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. There was a question I want to ask the young lady. I want to know in regards to the reparation and really the gentrification side. This goes to all the panels. Just to give you information, HUD link has a link that you can go right there and we'll talk about the gentrification side, but more in public to talk about the policies, because they have been policies, but I've been researching back to 1917 and gentrification. And I'm glad to see that you guys are tackling the problem, because it is a invisible problem. Real quick, I don't want to take a lot of your time, but I'm a financial service consultant for the last 47 years. And I deal with in the field myself as a practitioner. I'm not an academic, but I'm a public administration through ASPA. I'm a lifetime member since 1980. But the thing is, I hope you guys get a chance to look at those policies that started in 1967 through the control in Chicago, through Mount Laurel in 1976 in New Jersey, and here in Dallas, Texas. They did that same thing that you guys are speaking about, and nobody knows about it. 1920. So I just want to say I put my information in there just for you, and I think I put my email address in there, because those are my babies. I'm a policy writer for banks and stuff, and I'm a former banker. So you guys keep doing what you're doing. I'm excited to see this. I'm a little disappointed in the sense that this has been going on for 100 years. And what started this is an article by Betsy Martin, so 2005, and it said that the U.S. Shipping Act of 1917 was the first federal housing policy that started, and they did not want poor people, minorities, Blacks, or Hispanics to really be in this. However, Congress watered down the bill and changed it. The first housing policy was in New York in 1898. So I'm ecstatic to see you guys working on this, and I hope more of this get out. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for your time.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Edward. Menka, we got about 6 minutes. We can do.
I'm gonna try and get us in as fast as I can, and that's okay. Because I think what I'm gonna talk about is on a non-policy solution. And it's something, so as a high-level background, I'm here today as a practitioner. I do teach adjunct at Cal Poly, housing policy, affordable housing development, and real estate finance. And I've spent the last 20 years trying to unlock housing production across the full income spectrum as a way to address growing inequalities. I'm the treasurer of Alta Housing. It's an affordable nonprofit housing developer in Silicon Valley. I talk about, the last presenter spoke about wealth gain without guilt. I think that describes one of the past roles I held. I led Facebook's $1 billion investment in affordable housing. And I'm really happy to be here today in a different role in a startup, focusing, I think, on one of the less talked about, at least in my own research and experience, components to the solution pool. Now, super high level, I've worked for the past few years with partners, put in place partnerships across the private sector, government, NGOs, academic institutions, to move ahead the 3P approach. We want to address the housing affordability crisis while also addressing and limiting gentrification, and really working hard on tough solutions towards inequality. We do have to, the 3P framework is we have to protect those who are currently housed. We have to preserve the existing affordable housing stock. And the third P, producing more housing across the income spectrum, extremely complicated because it can really serve to exacerbate some of the two other Ps. And at the same time, if we don't relentlessly focus on producing more housing, we're going to continue to see worsened outcomes for the lowest income levels. And I'm here today and I'll be very brief because what I'm about to show you is more a high level overview of the current opportunity I know best, the company I'm at, where we're really seeking, it's that early stage housing production startup, where we're trying to prove the point that to address affordability, we really also cannot sacrifice sustainability and beauty, because the reality is the homes we live in impact our health, both physically and mentally. So it's not okay to just slap up cheap homes and call it good for everyone to live in. It's not. And I think because housing costs are so high, because we have a labor shortage, because we have a supply chain issue, and because we have skyrocketing inflation, I think the way to tackle this, and I'm putting my own time behind this hypothesis, is to unlock new ways to deliver housing. And so the current company I'm at is called Juno. And I'm not going to go deep into this because it's going to come across as a tech pitch, and it's really not meant to be. And I'm going to skip ahead to some of the policy implications. Essentially, we're trying to prove this point that we can accelerate production of homes in a beautiful way. This is an interior of one of our units. We're trying to do this through a platform approach, not build housing ourselves, enable others to build it as well, and get to 1 million new homes that are sustainable, affordable, from full income spectrum and beautiful by 2040. The approach we're taking is one of prefabrication that combines on-site and off-site labor. We're going to need to scale and increase the labor force to really make this happen in a way that benefits everyone. We're using mass timber because our buildings now are approaching carbon neutrality. We have to work to decarbonize the planet. Social equity, climate justice are core at what we do. And we can't move ahead new innovations that ignore these really important topics. Here's another interior shot of one of our apartments. We're focusing on multifamily apartments in urban areas. Here's an idea, how we show the expression of the natural materials, which are embodying carbon, creating healthier environments, and addressing affordability. I'm not going to go into how we do that because it's not as relevant to this conversation. Again, here's a slide that highlights, I won't go into the numbers, just know we're focusing relentlessly on decarbonizing the housing industry. And we're redefining sustainability. This is something I'm incredibly passionate about. We can't talk about environmental sustainability without also addressing economic sustainability. And that gets to rebalancing wealth gain so that everyone has an equal opportunity to gain and accrue wealth across generations. I'm excited to see the research from our last presenter move ahead for exactly that reason. I don't believe the tie between housing affordability and social mobility has been adequately evaluated and meaningful.
It's amazing. If someone asked us to repeat this, there's no way we could. I think it's just one of those once in a